Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be in this room together with friends from across the world for such an important discussion. And indeed, this is a unique place to have this discussion. We are in need of this dialogue for two basic reasons that I'd like to elaborate just briefly. One is we are in a new world in these years, and we're trying to navigate a new world. By that I mean the world that we have thought we knew in some places, a rather naive idea, was a Western-led world. And that was an idea that predominated from roughly 1820 to, I would say, the middle of the 20th century. But the notion of Western-led world continued at least until the end of the 20th century. That world is finished, but we don't know it yet. And it's that ignorance of the end of the Western-led world, which is at the heart of the very, very serious tensions between the United States and China, for example. Because the Western-led world is finished, the United States doesn't know it, and this means that we have a very deep misunderstanding about the nature of our current global reality. The second reason why we are here is that all together we are wrecking the world, the natural environment. So this is a feature of common humanity for a common global commons, which is the title of our meeting. I'd like to say just a few words about how we got here to give you my perspective. For most of the known history of the last 2 millennia, there was no question that Asia was the center of the world economy because it was well over half of the world population. The nature of life pretty much across the world did not vary so widely. So what we would call per capita incomes were similar. People were small farmers in villages, and this was true whether it was in Western Europe, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was in Chinese villages, whether it was in African villages. The population of the world was, from 1 AD onward, enormous in the Indian subcontinent and in China. And this meant that Asia was the center of gravity, if you would make that calculation, of the world economy as well as of the world demography. More than that, China was the dynamic country of the world technology and many civilizational inventions, especially during the Song dynasty from 960 to 1279, till the Mongol conquests. The Song dynasty was a remarkable period of technological fecundity, of economic gain, of multiple fundamental inventions, from the use of the compass for navigation, paper currency, public administration, ocean navigation, movable type printing, and countless other inventions that changed the world fundamentally. So not only was China populous, but China was really dominant. And throughout much of Asia, and especially East Asia, it was China that set the civilizational patterns for what is today's countries of Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea. And this civilization, which was a Neo-Confucian civilization, was a remarkable achievement. At this time, we had the high medieval period in Western Europe, and some breakthroughs were starting, a lot of wars, by the way, and but Europe would have looked to any observer at the time as a taker of technology, a receiver of technology, not as a maker or giver of technology. And the technology came from the East in many directions, from the Arab world, from the Indian subcontinent, from China. There are some notable dates. The worst economic policy mistake in human history was made by China in 1434, when the Ming Dynasty decided to end ocean navigation and to scrap the fleet of Admiral Zheng He. Because China would have discovered the New World, it would have discovered the Americas, it would have created a world economy, but China was concerned, the court was concerned about the incursions from the north, not from the gains of ocean navigation, and the great fleet of Admiral Zheng was ended, and those were the end of the ocean navigations. The oceans were given over to the Europeans, actually. This was really one of the most decisive own goals of human history, I have to say. Now, the next date that's important is 1492, because as China vacated the oceans, Portugal and Spain filled the oceans using Chinese technology, by the way, the ocean navigation and the gunpowder, which all had come from China, to begin an age of navigation. Still, without the fortuitous fact that heading west from Europe landed a continent that was not known to the Europeans, history would not have changed all that fundamentally. But the Americas became a resource base for Europe's development for the next 4 centuries, which fundamentally changed the world. And Adam Smith, writing in 1776, said that the 2 most significant events in the history of mankind were the discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492 and the discovery of the path around the Cape of Good Hope by Vasco da Gama in 1498. So that was a turning point. Still, Asia was dominant, but this little peninsula on the far west of Eurasia began to explore and ironically conquered the Americas, and that was by virtue of pathogens rather than any dominance, because the Europeans brought smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, and many other diseases, and wiped out the Native American populations by around 95%, and were able to conquer, therefore, 2 continents of massive resource base. So history began to change. The next date that I would suggest is fundamental is 1776. That's a very interesting year. 4 things happened that year. You know some of them. The most important was James Watt patented the steam engine in that year. A second decisive event was that Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. The third decisive event was that Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then there was something, a Declaration of Independence of some country also. All happened in that year. But the invention of the steam engine was a turning point as significant as 1434 and 1492, because though the steam engine had been invented by China, it had not been utilized by any scale in China. China had invented the steam engine about 700 years earlier. Watt improved the steam engine, with a condenser, and Britain became the first industrial country. And this was very significant because in 1839, my next date, Britain invaded China in the First Opium War. The war fought to make the world safe for opium addiction. Really a sordid act, but just an illustration of what had changed fundamentally in power. From China's dominance, now China was in defeat by the British, by a British expeditionary force from not quite halfway around the world, but was able to defeat the Chinese Ming or Qing, Qing Empire. Of course, I won't go into long history, but the defeats in the two Opium Wars was followed by the Taiping Rebellion and by probably the worst civil war perhaps in human history in terms of the human toll in the Taiping Rebellion. And China went from being an absolute great power to being a subjected country and one that faced extreme poverty and hardship later in invasion by many imperial powers along the coast, and then the invasion by Japan starting in 1894, 95, and then in the 20th century. For me, the next turning point is 1947 and 1949, the independence of India and the independence of China. I think there's one key point in history, which is a colonized or imperialized country cannot achieve economic development or success because it is not in the interest of the imperial power to have success in its colonies. The interest of an imperial power is extraction. And so until independence came after this terrible 100 years, China and India were left behind, far behind economic development. So the next turning point in history was the middle of the 20th century when Asia began to recover. And if you look statistically, Asia had been around 60% of world output for 1,800 years roughly, from as much as one can measure this, from 1 AD to roughly 1800 AD. And then by 1950, it had declined to 15%, or perhaps 20% of world output, though the population was still 60%. So the per capita income had collapsed. What we are experiencing now is the recovery of normality, not something outside of human experience, but actually the recovery of normality, because what was abnormal was that a small part of the world, the North Atlantic region, would so dominate the whole world. And that was by virtue of the technological advances, starting with steam engine, and then the militarization of those technologies, which led to a century of imperial domination by Western countries. This would have lasted longer, but the West fought two disastrous, bloody civil wars, World War I and World War II, and by the end of that period, it was, of course, morally, politically, economically, financially, militarily incapable of empire, and with some lagging battles, the countries found their way to independence. So Asia began to recover dramatically fast. And by around 2010, China was larger than the US economy in absolute size, measured in purchasing power terms, but not surprising because China is more than 4 times the US population, or was then. Now it's about 4 times the US population. And so naturally it would become a bigger country. 2 implications, and I'll stop here. One is that now that the whole world is industrializing, and we're going to have development everywhere. India was behind China by about 15 or 20 years, but now India is growing faster than China, is likely to continue to do so. Africa is going to grow faster than both India and China in the next 40 years because it's going to be catching up from farther back. And by the way, Africa right now has the same size population as China and India. All are 1.4 billion. But Africa will be the biggest by mid-century, by far. So if there's an African Union, the African Union will be the most populous part of the world by 2050, by far. And it will be a dynamic part of the world economy also. So we're going to have lots of mindset changes in the years ahead. But there are two significant conclusions from this. One is mainly the United States has been shocked at China's rise. And I have to say to my Chinese friends, you didn't ask permission, you know? The US is supposed to be in charge. And now, without US permission, you became so big and powerful, and that is a bit unforgivable in the American mentality. The Americans cannot figure it out because they know no history at all, I'm sorry to say. We're doing our best as teachers, but we're not doing very well. So the idea that what's happened in China is a return to normal is ununderstandable. And this is why there's so much tension right now. So it's very serious, and the tension came when China declared in the Made in China 2025 program, we will become key leaders of leading technologies. That was the biggest affront to the Americans. I say, bravo, go for it. This is good for the world. Technological advance anywhere lifts everyone, by the way, as long as it's not militarized and leads to destruction, but as long as it's used for human well-being. And by the way, Chinese technologies are already core to saving the world. Whether it's medicines like artemisinin or whether it's the lowest cost solar production, solar modules, this is Chinese technology and we need it. It's going to be critical for world well-being. But one thing is the tension coming with China's recovery. We need dialogue on this to understand it. So that's one part. Second is that as the whole world economy has grown roughly 100 times since James Watt's steam engine, I would say realistically maybe 250 times since James Watt's steam engine, we're wrecking the natural environment. We really are. It's extremely serious. It's very late in the day. And so we need a common understanding of how we're going to get our own now globally shared technologies under control. So that is why I'm so happy to be here. I do think we're going to figure this out. But the strangest part of globalization is how little global dialogue there is. It's the paradox. It's so easy to have connection. You can get on a Zoom with anybody, but it's a big event if an American official talks to a Chinese official. It should be happening dozens of times a day, not top news. And I keep offering to President Biden, I'll give you a Zoom link. You can call President Putin and make peace. Or a phone number. I'll lend you my cell phone. Make a call. But here we are completely interconnected, but we don't talk with each other. And the specialty of the church is talking with each other. So here we are. Thank you very much.